Hello, I'm John Hayes, the IFAS Dean for Research, and today I'd like to talk with you about some changes in IDC administration that we plan to implement this fall. I've vetted these ideas with the IFAS Faculty Assembly, the department chairs, the Research and Education Center directors, the other deans in IFAS, Senior Vice President, and the Vice President for Research. I'd like to have had the opportunity to talk with each of you individually, but with an organization this size, it's just not possible. So this will have to suffice. But today I'm going to talk to you about two basic changes. One is with respect to IDC allocation strategies for grants that receive low levels of IDC, and the other is our IDC allocation strategies for interdisciplinary centers. As a bit of background and context, though, I want to give you a very, very brief overview of the way this relates to our RCM budget model, or responsibility center management, that we use as our primary budget mechanism here at the University of Florida. And to do that, I want to refer to this quote from a recent book by Strauss and Curry. They indicate that RCM prescribes revenue and indirect cost allocation, or ownership rules, and then gives revenue-generating units the responsibility to cover the total costs of their programs, indirect as well as direct, from the revenues generated by their teaching, research, or business service activities. Complicated sentence perhaps, but the real key to this is this phrase, that the units have the responsibility to cover the total costs of their programs, both the indirect and the direct costs. Those costs occur in a lot of different ways. At the university level, there are costs. At the IFAS level, there's costs. Within your individual units, your RECs and your departments, as well as you have your own individual costs as a PI that you need to have covered. At the university level, to try to capture the costs that are incurred by our grants, they've assessed a 9% tax on all direct expenditures from all of our grants and contracts. These are real expenses of our programs that we have to cover. And IFAS is billed for this RCM tax of 9% at the end of the year. These are funds that can't be covered from our direct expenses on grants and contracts. They can only be covered from our indirect costs. So to give you a sense of the way this flows and the way that this works at the university and here in IFAS, it starts when the grant is awarded. Congratulations, you got a grant. And as a result of that, you begin to expend direct costs on that project, doing your field work or lab work or whatever that may be. As you expend those costs, two things happen simultaneously. First of all, IDC is generated if your grant allowed IDCs. Whatever that percent IDC rate is, those dollars begin to generate. And simultaneously, the RCM tax is assessed on those direct costs that you expended from your grant. The IFAS then pays for the RCM tax based on all the IDC that we've collected from all the grants and contracts across IFAS. And then following that, the balance after that tax has been paid is allocated using the standard formula, the same formula that's been used for years, and there's no plans to change that formula. Half of it goes to the Senior Vice President's office, 25% to the appropriate dean's office, 15% to the unit, typically the department or the REC, and then 10% flows to the PI. So under the current approach, what we've been doing is that the RCM tax has been assessed on all grants and contracts based on the total direct costs paid from IDC in a manner proportional to the amount of IDC generated in the past year. The IDC is then allocated according to that standard formula that I just talked about. What we plan to do in the future, beginning this fall, is the first 10% of IDC generated on any grant or contract will go directly toward paying that RCM tax. And so what that means for those grants that have very low levels of IDC, if you have 10% IDC or less that's generated, the entirety of those funds will go directly to pay those RCM tax. As it currently stands, those grants and contracts that generate high levels of IDC are significantly subsidizing those low IDC grants. There will still be some subsidy from those projects, but it will reduce the burden on those projects by having the first 10% of all IDC go towards paying that tax. The other change that we plan to make is with respect to the way that we handle administration of IDC to interdisciplinary centers. Now, when I use the term interdisciplinary centers, I'm not talking about our research and education centers. I'm talking about programs like the Center for Latin American Studies, or the Emerging Pathogens Institute, or the Genetics Institute. According to university policy, there's a process where they can be allowed to receive up to 7.5% of the IDC that's allocated. And we've been doing that here in IFAS as they have at colleges across campus. The structure of that we use here in IFAS is that 7.5% that goes to the interdisciplinary centers comes directly from the senior vice presidents and the dean's allocation. None of it comes from the unit, none of it comes to the PI, and we have no plans or intention to change that formula at this point. But what we do plan to change is the way that grants are identified and the IDC is identified to go to those interdisciplinary centers. Currently, what we do is for approved centers, in order for that center to receive a portion of the IDC, the center director needs to sign off on the DSR-1 form that you submit when you initially submit your grant. And then if the grant is in fact funded, IDC will then flow to that center based upon that signature of the center director at that time. In contrast, we're going to move to a system that's actually very similar to what they use in other parts of campus. And with that system, for each year, prior to allocation of the IDC, each PI would be given the opportunity to select up to 3 centers for each grant and contract to allocate their IDC to. The PIs would be provided an electronic notification prior to the IDC going out, and at that time they could select these centers using a very simple and straightforward web-based approach. So my hope is that that will increase the flow of IDC to our interdisciplinary centers where appropriate and provide a less cumbersome approach for you as a PI to identify which centers those are. So I hope that this video has provided you with a little bit better understanding and insight into the plans that we have for changing this structure in the coming year. And I thank you very much for your attention and listening.